What should we do as a region, as each island state? Citizens have rallied and railed against these initiatives, from threatening civil disobedience to the filing of or threatening to file lawsuits. You can understand then why UPBA and OEC's call to action is apt and timely. Let's be part of the solution. On that note, allow me to introduce our first speaker. J. Peter Figueroa is Professor of Public Health, Epidemiology, and HIV/AIDS at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica, where he has led the development of a Doctor of Public Health program. He was a national epidemiologist in Jamaica and led the national HIV/STI program from its outset in 1986 until 2008. He served as Chief Medical Officer from 1997 to 2002. He is chair of the Pan American Health Organization's Technical Advisory Group on Immunization, and he was a member of the World Health Organization Strategy Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization from 2009 to 2015. He is a member of the World Health Organization's Working Group on COVID-19 vaccines and a member of UNAIDS Scientific Expert Panel. He has published widely on communicable diseases, HIV, STIs, and public health, including 160 peer-reviewed papers and 3 books. He has received many awards for his work, including in 2009, a World Health Organization Award for Leadership in Global Health. To the extent that you can, please help me to make him welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You have certainly made me welcome with a very kind introduction. Distinguished panelists and distinguished audience, thank you for inviting me to this extremely important forum. My responsibility is to provide some context in relation to the COVID pandemic and response. I have no financial interests or conflict of interests. We know that the pandemic has transformed our past 18 months. It has crippled economies, disrupted lives, livelihoods, and social life with over 4 million deaths. This is the epidemic curve for Jamaica. And you can see that we are just coming out of a significant surge of cases, that huge peak, that mountain of cases from which we are coming out of. And you know, the question does arise, could we have somehow prevented some of these cases, and especially the deaths, if we were able to act earlier and more decisively? Globally, there are 182 million reported confirmed cases of COVID, but this is an underestimate of the actual number of cases and deaths. In Jamaica, over 50,000 cases, over 1,000 deaths. Trinidad and Tobago, over 32,000 cases, nearly 1,000 deaths. Barbados, over 4,000 cases, 47 deaths. This is a disease that we have to treat seriously. It is true that the majority of cases of COVID are either mild or moderate, and persons recover. But as many as 14% may be severe with difficulty of breathing, and 6% may actually be critical, in which there is respiratory failure, septic shock, and organ failure, requiring intensive care and often resulting in death. Now, there's a concept of long COVID. As many as 30% of persons who develop severe COVID continue to have some symptoms for months following their recovery. And even persons who have mild or moderate COVID may be subject to long COVID. Of course, the case fatality increases significantly with age, and 1 out of 4 persons over the age of 80 are at risk of death. Now, I wanted to share something about the transmission dynamics of this virus, SARS-CoV-2. 2. Persons with symptoms are probably responsible for passing on the infection to 41% of those persons who develop COVID. What many people do not realize is that in the 2 to 3 days before someone develops symptoms, the person is highly infective and contributes to perhaps 1/3 of all infections due to COVID. Of course, persons who are asymptomatic can also contribute to transmission of COVID. We know the measures to help prevent the spread, especially the wearing of masks, physical distancing, avoided and restricting crowds indoors in particular, and basic hand hygiene are perhaps the most important conditions to help prevent spread. And then there are other measures that are taken community-wide, including lockdowns. Now, towards the end of last year, this graph simply shows that both in Europe and more so in the United States, there was a steep increase in the number of cases of COVID. And I show this because I want to show this slide where once there are an increase in the number of new cases of COVID, you're going to get severe COVID, which requires hospitalization. So you notice the red hospitalization line follows the blue. Likewise, once you get a surge of cases, within 3 weeks, you are going to start getting deaths due to COVID. The main takeaway lesson here is that you don't wait until you start to get deaths before you put in place decisive measures to control spread. You have to take measures early to reduce the number of deaths. Now, towards the end of last year, both in South Africa as well as Britain, there were significant increases of cases. And these were associated with what we call variants of concern. These are viruses that have mutated from the original strain and which are more transmissible. And in Britain, there was the Alpha variant, and in South Africa, the Beta variant. Now, just at the turn of last year into January, the rollout of the COVID vaccines began. And over the past 6 months, there have been over 3 billion doses of vaccine administered globally, mainly in the advanced countries. And then, of course, you can see China, over 1 billion doses administered. The UK has vaccinated with 1 dose at least 68% of their population, the US 55%, China 45%, Jamaica is just at 6%. Okay. If we look at the Caribbean, you'll see that Barbados, Cuba, and Guyana are more advanced with getting their populations vaccinated, between 25 to 33% getting at least 1 dose, and in Trinidad, 16% of the population. Now, once the vaccination rollout began, you could see that immediately the number of new corona coronavirus cases per million residents began to decrease in the US, in Europe, in Canada. And in fact, over the past several months, you can see the dramatic decline in both cases and deaths in the United States. And globally, also from January to March, there was a decrease in the number of cases. But then in April, we started to get a significant surge of cases. This surge of cases was related to the surge of cases in India, where another variant of concern, Delta, really transmits readily. And there was some complacency in India where they had hundreds of thousands of people meeting for both political and religious rallies. Currently in the UK, the Delta variant is now taking off. And you can see that while there was a decrease in the number of cases, just over the past month, there is a significant increase in the number of cases due to COVID in the UK, but the number of deaths has remained pretty constant. And the reason for this is because of their high vaccination level. Hospitalizations are beginning to increase, and it's mainly younger adults who are not vaccinated who are ending up in the hospital. So this just puts us on alert in the Caribbean that we need to be alert for another surge to the Delta variant. Now, this graph shows the proportion of people vaccinated with at least one dose of COVID vaccine between June. And this is put in together by income, different countries. So you can see in high income countries, the blue line shows an increase from 20% to 40% of persons being vaccinated in high income countries. The sudden rise in the upper middle income graph in purple is due to vaccination data being added in early June from China. But look at low income and low middle income countries. They have under 10% of their population vaccinated. In Africa, under 3%. So it shows you the significant inequity in the access to vaccines globally. And this is a huge challenge that we need to overcome. Now, we understand the basis for vaccinating health workers. They're on the front lines. They have to look after patients, and you don't want health workers getting infected because it removes them from the health service, but also they could become infected and in turn pass the infection on to other patients. The rationale for vaccinating the elderly is based on the fact that the death rate due to COVID increases dramatically with increased age. So the infection fatality rates are shown in that graph. And 1 in 4 persons over 80, maybe 1 in 6 to 8 persons over 70 are at risk of dying. And the elderly have more comorbidities. These increase with age. So using age as a criteria to prioritize vaccination is very important. The safety profile of all the vaccines is very encouraging. There may be a local reaction, and sometimes persons have a little fever, fatigue, headache with the vaccination. This is just the immune system responding to the vaccine. However, there is a very rare condition seen with the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which causes a particular kind of blood clot, and we give it the name thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome. This occurs at a rate of approximately 6 cases per million doses, usually within the first 2 weeks after getting the vaccine. Now, persons who present with this severe side effect usually present with a severe persistent headache or severe abdominal pain, which gets them to the doctor. So the doctors are now sensitized to look out for such rare side effects. What people may not realize is that persons who are vaccinated actually have less blood clots than the general population. If you have 1 million persons over the age of 50, approximately 5,000 of them will get blood clots each year. And if you have severe COVID, there's a 1 out of 2 chance or higher that you're going to get blood clots. So when you're admitted to hospital, frequently you're put on a blood thinner. So the benefit risk ratio is very much in favor of taking the vaccine. And all persons who have comorbid conditions, cancer, HIV, they can take the vaccine. Of course, if you're actively ill, you should wait until you recover. If you're getting a cancer treatment and have very low immunity, it's better to wait, recover, and then take the vaccine. Usually, if you have confirmed COVID, you wait 4 to 6 months before you take the vaccine. Pregnant women and breastfeeding women can take the vaccine. 1 dose of AstraZeneca is 70% effective, and it usually takes 3 to 4 weeks after the first dose, 7 to 14 days after the second dose to be fully protected. The duration of protection is likely to be over 12 months and probably well over 12 months. We need to learn how to live with COVID for the foreseeable future. The vaccine is not a silver bullet. We still have to have the non-pharmaceutical measures. And we're going to continue to learn more about COVID. So the situation is dynamic and we have to stay alert. Now, when it comes to the actual theme, I have 1 slide I just want to share here with you. We have a lot of experience, decades of experience now with the childhood vaccines. I've put the initials for them there. There are over 10, 12 childhood vaccines that we're used to giving to our children. And we have saved millions of lives of our children by using these vaccines, whether polio, DBT, measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis B. These are really important vaccines. And those of us many of us in the field, particularly within the Caribbean, we are of the view that having a vaccination law that requires vaccination before school age, and in effect, having mandatory vaccination, it is saving millions of lives. And the only exemption should be for medical reasons only. And it's just like how we chlorinate our water. We have food standards. We drive on one side of the road. You're not free to decide on which side of the road you drive. This, I think, there is a strong justification for doing this. And more jurisdictions are doing this and showing that it encourages people to get vaccinated. When it comes to the COVID vaccine, I'm rounding off now. This is a safe and effective vaccine, but it is a new vaccine. It's on emergency use listing, and there are many people who are hesitant due to misinformation or they're just cautious. So I do not think it is justified to make this vaccine mandatory at this time, although it is a highly effective and safe vaccine. It would just be too distressful for too many people, and it would not be effective. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Figueroa. I suppose we'll hear more from you during the panel discussion. At this time, I'm going to be introducing our second speaker, Dr. George Mitchell. Dr. George Mitchell is currently the Executive Director of the Accreditation Secretariat of the Grenada Medical and Dental Council. Prior to this assignment, he served as the Chief Medical Officer in the Ministry of Health, Social Security, and International Business, a position which he occupied from 2012 to 2020. Dr. Mitchell led Grenada's response to the chikungunya in 2014 and Zika in 2016. During his pre-retirement period in early 2020, he was recalled to spearhead the coordination of Grenada's national response to the COVID-19 pandemic. On completion of his medical degree, he completed a one-year internship at General Hospital in St. George. 2 years later, he served at the district level as district medical officer before he became senior medical officer in 2010 with responsibility for chronic non-communicable diseases, primary health care. He was also responsible for providing direct supervision of the district medical officers throughout Grenada. Over the years, Dr. Mitchell has represented the Ministry of Health, Social Security, and International Business on several committees, including the Grenada Medical and Dental Council, the Allied Health Professionals Council, the Pharmacy Council, the Nursing Council, and the Pesticide Control Board. Additionally, Dr. Mitchell represented the Ministry of Health, Social Security, and International Business on many regional bodies, including the Technical Advisory Committee of the Caribbean Public Health Agency, the Caribbean Accreditation Authority for Medical Education and other professionals, and CARPA Board of Directors. He also represented Grenada on the Pan American Health Organization's Executive Board and was Grenada's representative and focal point for the International Health Regulations and the International Atomic Energy Agency. He is a member of the COVID-19 subcommittee in Grenada. Dr. Mitchell has participated in several research projects and publications. Please join me in making him welcome.
Thank you very much. Am I being heard? Shane? Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Madam Moderator, for this very, very auspicious introduction. I am actually very, very honored to be invited to participate in this discourse. And I want to personally thank Mr. Ruggles Ferguson, President of the OCCBA, for this invitation to participate in this very timely and historic discussion on mandatory vaccine, legal, justified, or effective. I feel very honored to be part of this prestigious panel, and also even more prestigious, if I would say, listening public. I want to thank Professor Figueroa for this very stimulating presentation, and Professor Figueroa is extremely experienced, and of course, you would have heard from his bio how experienced he is. My presentation, however, would focus or would bring to bear a more public health perspective to this discussion. For me, it is important to bring this perspective, since my practice has basically allowed me to make a crucial distinction between public health decisions and those that one can engage with or in as a private practitioner dealing with individuals on a one-by-one basis. Public health, for me, has basically demonstrated that it is the way to go when dealing with situations like this. To my slide, I want to raise in my presentation the following topics: justification of public health measures, other public health measures, vaccination as a public health measure, the state and public health obligations, individual rights versus responsibility, today's reality, and let's look at mandatory vaccination. We all know, and I think Professor Figueroa mentioned it, that for centuries now, states and authorities have been engaged in taking public health measures to protect their populations. And towards the end of his discussion, of course, he mentioned some of the areas in which that was done. And I just wanted to quickly mention again the use of chlorification for drinking water is a public health issue that was dealt with back then, as well as the issues and laws governing food preparation. That is what has kept us safe from a lot of diseases, including typhoid fever, cholera, and foodborne illnesses like salmonella, etc. Now, in recent times, and that is quite interesting, states have mandated the wearing of masks, social distancing, sanitization measures, and even curfew to prevent the spread of COVID. And to my understanding, many persons have not in earnest pushed back against the wearing of masks or social distancing, etc., in order to control this disease. And that was a public health measure taken by the state. Other public health measures that I just wanted to remind you of, and that seem to have gone ahead without much ado in the past, laws to deal with smoking, particularly smoking indoors, the wearing of seat belts, the use of helmets by motorcyclists, and the mandatory wearing of hard hats on construction sites. And of course, in many countries, we have anti-mosquito laws that would prevent mosquitoes from passing on their deadly diseases. And most of these are being implemented by states. They are part of the state legislations and laws. And we virtually accept them for what they are, to prevent illnesses and deaths among our population. I just wanted to talk about vaccination as a public health measure. And I think Professor Figueroa mentioned that in his last few slides. For centuries, we have been using vaccination to prevent diseases, and those have saved millions of lives and continue to do so. And, you know, in the age of COVID that we're living in right now, we're not talking about vaccination for COVID alone, but we know that vaccines have saved millions of lives for non-viral illnesses outside of COVID. And I want to specifically mention yellow fever. And for yellow fever, for example, you have to have right now a vaccination card to be able to travel to other countries. Other than that, you're not allowed. So this is a mandate, and this is countries have legislated that. And the introduction in the last decades of the human papilloma virus have saved millions of women and men as well, boys and girls, from developing cervical cancer as well as penile cancer. So those are the measures. And it is important that, you know, the World Health Organization have said to us that vaccination is one of the most powerful tools in terms of public health goods ever undertaken by mankind. Now I'm going to introduce a couple slides that might be on the edge of being debatable here, but you know, I think we are into a discourse that for our edification, and it hinges on the state's obligation to protect the citizens in general terms. And you know, I think I am not a constitutional expert, but the protection of its citizens is enshrined in most constitutions. And certainly in the case of Grenada, where individual rights are protected, the issue is within that same constitution, you have an exception, or you have exceptions, and public health is one of them. I just want to add here, as I said before, that leading public health organizations like PAHO and the World Health Organizations have backed the use of vaccination to safeguard human lives. Now, let me add quickly that PAHO and WHO cannot demand of any countries that they implement laws in a mandatory way in terms of vaccination. They are basically there to encourage, to provide a scientific proof, and to lead and advise accordingly. PAHO has also said, and Professor Figueroa said it just now, that the exceptions in terms of taking the vaccine are few, and mainly in the realm of medical issues where persons may have preconditions or underlying conditions that disallow them or put them at risk for taking the virus. Now, this debate, of course, is I think at the crux of what we're talking about, between the individual, the right of the individual to refuse inoculation or the vaccine, and the real concerns in terms of the community and the state. And this confronts us, as our moderator was saying, directly as a people right now. And of course, I would not dare to delve into this. We have, you know, scores of luminary professors on the call and to come in this conversation to talk more about that. What about fundamental rights? Now, let me just quickly, you know, bring an example here. We do have rights to do almost anything we want, and I just want to say that, including going for a drink. But we do not have the right, as far as I know, to infringe on the rights of others. And I just wanted to bring the drink and drive law to the conversation, and to say that, as far as I know, the state even takes preemptive action if you're found to be drinking under the influence. And that's why we have breathalyzers, etc. In other words, if you are deemed to endanger anyone's life, then you can be charged for doing so. And so that is a discourse, as I said, that might expand into the realm of whether or not someone is vaccinated, and the discourse as to whether or not that person endangers someone's life as a result of not being vaccinated. I must say, however, that I think that an individual has the right to refuse a vaccine based on his medical conditions, or if that person does not endanger anybody's at all because they don't interact with anybody. You may be living by yourself or on an island by yourself, etc. But At the same time, I think that the state does have the responsibility and the obligation to protect its population from both physical and biological hazards. And so the question is asked whether or not contextually mandatory vaccine is something that we need to delve deeply into. What is today's reality? I just wanted to go on here. Today's reality is that, and Professor Figueroa spoke to that, is that millions of persons, human beings, have died. Over 4 million at the moment. Many have been hospitalized. Many people have lost their jobs. The economic fallout has been tremendous. We do have a situation, and Professor spoke about it too, where we have a new variant that is more virulent, that is more transmissible, that according to WHO has been found in over 95 countries now. And there is a real possibility that there may be new variants in the future with higher transmissibility, higher virulence, and may cause more and more deaths. But I just wanted to reiterate and take from Professor Figueroa's that it has been proven that with more vaccination, that there have been less hospitalization, less deaths among these countries or in those countries where the population has been vaccinated. So the question is posed here: should countries, should governments, should public health officials, should us legal luminaries and trade union leaders and all of us, should we sit by and wait and see what happens next? Or should our society take action based on the data, based on the reality that we are seeing? My position, my discussion here is that whatever decisions we take, I think it's fundamental that if we are going to think about implementing any mandatory laws or actions regarding the taking of COVID-19 vaccine, there are some things that the governments, that states needs to do. And that's one, extensive consultation must be held with the people. There must be concerted education at the level of the communities and sensitization. There also must be a mechanism to enable for exceptional cases and persons with contraindications to be allowed to opt out. And there must be measures taken to ensure that we can do everything that we possibly can do to ensure that persons' individual rights are also respected. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope that bringing a public health perspective to vaccination would enlighten us and would put us in a better position, of course, to contemplate and discuss the issue of whether or not mandatory vaccine is something that we want to, as a society, contemplate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. And for those who are just joining us, we have just heard from the medical practitioners. And in summary, before we get to the legal experts, we have heard that vaccines have been a part of our lives from time immemorial. They save lives because we have been saved from diseases such as cholera, diphtheria, measles, rubella, and the list goes on. We hear as well that society is basically rules-based, and therefore rules will have to be made in order to manage these things in the interest of public health. And speaking of rules and rights, who better to tell us about that than the legal experts, and beginning with none other than Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine. She is the Dean of the Faculty of Law, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and professor of labor law and offshore financial law. An Oxford and Cambridge scholar, she holds a doctorate in law from Oxford, an LLM from Cambridge, and an LLB from the University of the West Indies. Professor Antoine is an attorney and an award-winning scholar who has published 13 books and numerous scholarly articles. Her work has been described by international reviewers as original and insightful. She is an international consultant, temporary Court of Appeal judge, and an activist. I suppose that also means that she's controversial. She was president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Washington, the OAS Rapporteur for Persons of African Descent, Indigenous Persons, and head of the OAS Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Unit. She is currently the chair of the CARICOM Commission on Marijuana and president of the Family Planning Association, a Cambridge Fellow, a member of Trinidad and Tobago's Industrial Relations Advisory Committee, and the only Caribbean person to be appointed as an honorary fellow of the International Society for Trust Practitioners, STEP. She worked previously at the International Labour Organization in Geneva. Professor Antoine is an exceptional Caribbean woman. She made history when she won the Regional Vice Chancellor's Award of Excellence twice, in 2006 for research, and in 2013 for public service. In 2018, she was honored by the UE as an outstanding alumnus. She has been highly regarded for her transformational work, which includes the CARICOM Labor Law Report, the catalyst for labor law reform and non-discrimination legislation in the region, CSME legal reform. The TCI Legislative Reform Project credited her with returning the TCI to self-governance, offshore financial policy, and more recently, the CARICOM report on marijuana. Professor Antoine is described by governments, international sources, and others as a change agent and remains committed to the development within the framework of human rights. She enjoys painting, gardening, and is a trained classical singer. Professor Antoine, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, distinguished moderator. And thank you to Akbar for inviting me to participate in this very important and exciting event. Good evening, everyone. I heard we have a full house, so congrats to the organizers. I do believe that a compulsory requirement for the COVID-19 vaccine is justifiable in law, whether constitutionally or in the private sector. However, legitimacy in the law is not the only factor to consider in making such a determination. There are social and industrial relations implications. So it might be legally correct, but not necessarily desirable. And of course, I'm assuming that vaccines will be available, otherwise, this issue doesn't arise. There are two key principles that ground the identification of the legality of compulsory vaccination. One is the principle of reasonableness, and that it holds whether we interrogated the constitutional parameters of the issue or private actions in labor law or administrative law. And the other is proportionality. That's key. To take the route that is least harmful to human rights. This is an additional hurdle for legality once we determine rights are being limited. And there's no doubt that mandatory vaccination involves the abrogation of rights, or at least a sifting of rights, and not just individual rights either, to dignity, to privacy, personal liberty, religion, and so on, but collective rights, economic and social rights, the right of the public to health and to safety, and even to life. And we know, of course, that no right is absolute and law doesn't exist in a vacuum. But we can't deny that COVID-19 has changed the circumstances of the entire global community. And looking at the parameters for limiting rights in our constitutions as well as past precedents, I believe it is likely that the state will have a wide margin of appreciation in enacting mandatory COVID-19 laws. All of our constitutions permit such limitations if reasonable. There are different formulae reasonably justifiable, and so on. But they all recognize the public interest in assessing reasonableness. And in most cases, the constitutions in the region spell this out explicitly. So, for example, Section 1, Barbados, Section 11, Section 14 in Jamaica, Guyana, Section 14, and so on. Trinidad has a different formula. Maybe a lower threshold, some might argue. You can limit rights except where not reasonably justifiable. So there's a presumption of constitutionality there. And significantly, several of the constitutions specify public health, as what you heard from Dr. Mitchell. And even going further, infectious diseases as acceptable rationales for limiting rights. So many of the rights, freedom of conscience and so on, movement, they are subject to the public health and this a special mention of infectious diseases in some, including the right to personal liberty, which is very relevant here and would ordinarily protect us against compulsion. That is specifically compromised in several of our constitutions. For example, in Section 13 of Barbados, Section 3 of St. Lucia, and so on, where there's infectious contagious disease. And I don't believe that the recent case of Robinson and the AG of Jamaica, the 2019 case on privacy, very important judgment, which I agree with actually, and it declared that in free and democratic societies, persons have a right to be left alone and to retain control over their body, mind, heart, and soul. That's true, but I don't think it can be taken as a carte blanche denial of limitations or that it can override some of the specific permissions in the Constitution, especially where Caribbean states so clearly control decisions about our bodies, especially women's bodies in other respects. So I think it's a fairly easy sell for me to accept that mandatory vaccination is constitutionally legitimate. And we have good precedent for it since we already have laws mandating vaccines for children's entry into schools. And, you heard from the doctors about those measles, yellow fever, and so on. And that came from an old case, 1905, Jacobson in the US. So the horse has already bolted. We have those laws, at least for children. Moreover, I think the trend recently is to lean in favor of public health imperatives and not to prioritize individual rights. That's the reason why those challenges in Trinidad, and I don't know if they were elsewhere, by persons who were locked out of their own countries, which really goes to the heart of your citizenship rights, they didn't stand. And it's also the rationale for the current regulations, which limit off rights to freedom of movement in the states of emergency, the forcing of wearing of masks, and so on. And we know that limiting rights is really premised on the notion of harm. And it's difficult, I think, to find situations where harm is more prominent than a pandemic where people are dying. So I think it's a fairly low bar to cross. And I would urge you to consider that you don't look at rights, individual rights in a vacuum, and that in this particular instance, there may also be a clash of individual rights. So both anti-vaxxers have the rights, yes, and then those who are not anti-vaxxers have the right to personal liberty. There are some who may not want to come to work, for instance, if they feel that they're in danger. So their rights are also being compromised, and employers must make these decisions. So we must be balancing these rights, and anything we do clearly is for the greater good. But I would urge workers and unions not to see it as a punitive measure, but a protective one. Of course, quite paternalistic in the way that we have laws that you wear seat belts and so forth. In terms of proportionality as applied to COVID, I think what we look here, what it brings into view is the issue of risk. How great is the risk for the society if we do not vaccinate? Is the risk the same in all sectors? Are there alternative methods, PPE, social distancing, and so, which are less invasive of human rights, but which are just as effective? And we're beginning to get some of the answers. In a recent case, Vavrika and the Czech Republic and EU case, the key issue here was that other methods, which relied on persuading persons and education to take the hepatitis vaccine, were not effective or sufficient to protect the public. And therefore, the court felt the state could mandate in those circumstances because compulsory vaccination there was considered necessary in a democratic society. So the first step should be to persuade and to educate. But if that does not work, And if the hype about that vaccines sort of are pervasive, then a state may need to use more forceful methods. With COVID, I think it is time sensitive, and I think it's a dynamic situation. Context matters in this whole question of proportionality. Just a couple of months ago in Trinidad and Tobago or St. Kitts, for example, mandatory vaccination may not have been a proportionate response, given that at that time we thought we had the virus under control. But now, with the high death rates and the recognition that alternative methods are perhaps not working, maybe. So, certainly, too, these alternative methods are less effective in certain high risk sectors. The healthcare is an obvious example. We heard earlier that, in terms of the hospitals and healthcare workers, how they can spread it. In the UK, over 8,700 persons got infected from hospitals. And this is why the UK has now said they will make it mandatory for healthcare workers. France has done that too, still controversial. And we know from Australia that at least even one person can infect an entire population. So I also believe that the proportionality principle will encompass this medical risk question and the question of medical efficacy. If science shows that the vaccine is not going to be so effective, then limiting rights may not be justifiable. There's also the question of the legal direction of regulation being more nuanced to make it more palatable. So instead of making it a positive requirement to force a vaccine or to prevent employers from mandating it, the legal approach can be passive or it can be indirect, it can be soft law. And this happens even before COVID. It's often de facto. So, for example, there's no law that says you must take a yellow fever vaccine, but we know that if you want to fly to many places in the world, and certainly if you're from Trinidad, then you can't go anywhere without it. So no one forces you to do it, but if you don't, well, you can't do what you want. And a similar situation is already happening with the COVID vaccine and the airlines. Just this week, Cal said that you can't fly if you have not been vaccinated, if you're a non national. No one bats an eyelid. There is an illusion of choice. That approach actually has worked with courts before. For example, in Europe and the UK, in terms of preventing persons wearing their hijab at workplaces, the court said, well, you're not forced. You have a choice. You can work somewhere else. And that kind of thinking is already emerging in terms of COVID. In the first case that came up in Texas, the case of Bridges and the Methodist Hospital. And the court said, well, the vaccine was not coercion, since the Methodist Hospital, quote, was in the business of saving lives without giving them the COVID 19 virus. It is a choice made to keep staff, patients, and their families safer. Bridges could freely choose to accept or refuse the vaccine. However, if she refuses, she will simply need to work somewhere else, unquote. So that was pretty clear. It's part of the bargain, the court said, and the public's interest in having a hospital capable of caring for patients during a pandemic far outweighs protecting the vaccination preferences. And there's also been a guidance note to that effect in the USA Equal Opportunities Commission saying it is acceptable legally. While the Constitution does not bind private actors, such as employers, airlines, and so on, except in Jamaica, of course, I also believe that constitutionality will influence the question of reasonableness in the private law context. So, if it is constitutionally justifiable, it is likely that the courts will find it reasonable for employers to take some such measures. Conversely, if constitutionally suspect or too harsh, it will be very difficult for employers or universities to justify it. And we won't know until it's challenged. And of course, I just want to say up front that this argument that because there's no law mandating it, employers cannot compel it is completely false and simplistic. Law doesn't prescribe or regulate everything. Where the law is silent, the assumption is that it's permissible unless the court say otherwise. We can't regulate everything in life. And we already have several examples of requirements that are not the basis of a law, starting with the compulsory medicals at the workplace, and many sorts of requirements for the job that we accept. And similarly, many healthcare institutions already require staff to be vaccinated for known contagious diseases, yeah, including medical students and all have that. Of course, the reasonableness question also has to take into account the whole question of assessing risks to others if you do not vaccinate, and the duty of the employer to maintain health and safety in the workplace, which is a duty at common law, an implied term, as well as a statutory duty in many parts of the Caribbean. And there's a duty also of the workers to act safely to co-workers and to the public. Context again is important. A high risk environment will make it more reasonable to compel vaccines, and a low risk workplace, maybe social distancing and homework and so on will be sufficient. And so it's less reasonable. So here again, you have an echo of proportionality. Incidentally, I disagree that requiring a vaccine will be an unlawful unilateral change in terms and conditions of employment, because health and safety is also a contractual term, and that would trump others. And of course, we know that in exceptional circumstances, you can change employment terms and conditions, although we don't encourage it. So, in that sense, where the employer seeks to honor that duty, it can't be said that terms and conditions are being altered. I think what we really have are two competing terms and conditions or norms. And equally, the employer can be held to task for failing to take steps to protect the worker and the co-workers. And that is all part of the evaluation of what is reasonable and fair. In a high risk environment, it might actually be irresponsible or even negligent to permit the employees to work without a vaccine. And some of them are scared. A worker might refuse to come to work because of it. Is that a time or is that just a
It
noise?
is.
Okay.
It is.
So I will wrap up. So I just wanted to end with a note about the experimental issue. Is it the 5 minutes or the 1 minute?
The 1 minute.
Okay. So on the experimental issue, yes, the courts will, however, as they did in HIV, look to the science and take a fairly orthodox approach. And we have had the Babrika case as well conforms to that deference to orthodox science. They would not listen to the skeptics and so on. It has WHO approval, and we see that in Bridges as well. And anyway, that experimental argument is short-lived. It's fluid because every day that passes, it becomes less experimental. So, in short, I think they are good grounds. There are also economic rationales. If you have to keep quarantine people every Monday morning, as is happening in Trinidad, we need direction, we need certainty in the law. But at minimum, for high risk sectors, the nuanced position is that yes, it is justifiable. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Antoine. And now for our final speaker, Dr. the Honorable Lloyd Barnett. He is a national of Jamaica and a practicing attorney at law. He has appeared as counsel in several important cases in public, commercial, and property law in the Superior Courts of Jamaica and several Caribbean countries, as well as the Privy Council and the Caribbean Court of Justice. He has been aptly described by the prestigious Chambers Global Rankings publication as an elder statesman. Dr. Barnett has served as president of the Jamaican Bar Association, president of UPBA, chairman of the General Legal Council, the Jamaican Council for Human Rights, the University Council of Jamaica, the Caribbean Council of Legal Education, and Citizens Action for Free and Fair Elections. He has served as a member of the Police Services Commission in Jamaica. He has been a civil society leader, human rights advocate, former senator in the Parliament of Jamaica. He is the author of 2 books on Jamaica's constitution and numerous articles on a variety of legal subjects, which have earned him the respect of the judicial and academic authorities. Dr. Barnett was a member of the Regional Judicial and Legal Services Commission at its inception and deputy chairman from 2012 to 2016. Dr. Barnett served as the chair of the Papers and Program Committee of the initial Commonwealth Law Conference held in Ocho Rios, Jamaica in 1986, as well as co-chair